So have you heard about this whole Panama Canal situation? Well, it's kind of grabbed my attention lately. Seems like something that could really shake things up, with global trade and everything.
Oh, absolutely. This is way more than just another business deal going down. We're talking potential geopolitical shifts, the kind that could really change how things move around the world. Big stuff.
Okay, so for everyone listening, let's break it down. The basics are this. BlackRock, that huge American investment firm, they're apparently making a play for the major ports at both ends of the Panama Canal. We're talking a potential $23 billion deal here. And the seller, that's CK Hutchinson, a company based in Hong Kong, run by, well, the billionaire Li Ka-shing. We've been digging into a transcript from a YouTube discussion, some really sharp analysis, and we're going to try and unpack it all for you.
What's wild is just how strategically important this whole thing is. BlackRock isn't going for some tiny piece of the action. They're aiming for the Cristobal port on the Atlantic side and the Balboa port on the Pacific. These are the gateways, right? To a waterway that handles something like 5% of all global trade. Think about that for a second. Electronics, food, raw materials, we're talking trillions of dollars flowing through there every year.
Yeah, no kidding. And, we got to remember, CK Hutchinson, they're not small potatoes either. They've got their hands in 43 ports across 23 countries. So these two Panamanian ports, those are big pieces in a much larger global puzzle. This isn't some minor reshuffling.
Nope, this could signal like a fundamental shift in who controls these absolutely vital pieces of global infrastructure. And as you mentioned, it's causing quite a stir, especially with China and Hong Kong.
Oh yeah, some serious pushback growing there. John Lee, the leader of Hong Kong, he even came out publicly and said this whole deal deserves some serious attention. You really get the feeling they see this as something with far-reaching consequences.
It certainly seems that way. Beijing's talking antitrust issues, national security risks. Their argument boils down to this. You can't have one entity, especially one based in the U.S., holding so much sway over a vital artery of global commerce. If one company controls both ends of this passage, well, that has huge implications for fair trade, for national interests, for everything.
And this is where things get really interesting, right? We're seeing these different perspectives pop up fast. One commentator, Gordon Chang, even suggested that if Beijing tries to block this deal, it could be a direct challenge to the U.S. president himself. That's how high the stakes have gotten, politically speaking, all because of this potential business deal.
It really shows you how a seemingly straightforward commercial transaction can get tangled up in all the complexities of global power dynamics. You've got these major players, competing interests, and it all collides in a situation like this.
And then there's the U.S. side of things. Former President Trump, he's been pretty vocal, praising this potential acquisition as the U.S. reclaiming the canal. You definitely sense a strong nationalist sentiment there.
You're right, and there's even this theory mentioned in the source we were looking at that Trump might have actually nudged BlackRock to go after this as a way to push back against China's growing influence, in Latin America and the Caribbean. Given how vital the Panama Canal is for global shipping, that wouldn't be a surprising move at all, strategically.
Remember that 5% figure? All that global trade, owning those two key ports, as one commentator put it, it's like controlling the on-ramp to the entire global trade highway. Imagine that leverage in trade talks and international negotiation.
Exactly. You control the entrance and exit points to a crucial waterway like that, well, you've got a lot of say in how goods flow around the world. Delivery times, supply chain resilience, costs, it all gets impacted.
So let's turn to the seller for a moment. Like Ka-shing, this guy is a titan of the business world, right? Decades of influence, especially in Hong Kong. Interestingly, he made what seemed like a pretty pointed remark, aimed maybe at Trump, about opposing the abusive use of coercion in global economic affairs. Sounds like he's feeling the pressure from all sides in this situation.
Yeah, that's sharp. Like Cushing, he and navigating these tricky political and economic waters for years. Coercion, that word could be interpreted in a lot of ways, but it definitely hints at how delicately positioned he is, stuck between U.S. interests and what Beijing wants. And remember, he sold off a lot of his mainland Chinese real estate a while back, something that apparently didn't go over too well in Beijing. Adds another layer to all this, doesn't it?
And speaking of timing, this BlackRock deal pops up at a pretty interesting moment. Just recently, they got a lot of attention for, well, stepping back from a big climate change initiative and changing their approach to DEI. Could this Panama Canal move be like a strategic pivot for them?
It's definitely possible. Huge firms like BlackRock, they're always looking at their portfolios, reassessing their priorities, especially with the world changing so fast. Acquiring this kind of critical infrastructure, something with inherent strategic value, could be a way for them to diversify, to gain influence in a sector that's only going to become more important in the long run. Maybe we're seeing a trend towards these tangible assets, the ones with geopolitical weight.
And what about the money side of things? Our source pointed out that BlackRock's offer, that $23 billion, it works out to something like 13 times the EBITDA of these ports. But typically, similar assets, they trade at around 16 times EBITDA. Some analysts, even folks at Morningstar, they've suggested BlackRock's might be overpaying, like significantly, based on the usual financial metrics.
That difference definitely raises some eyebrows. Obviously, financial returns are important for any investment firm, but in this specific case, it seems like those strategic and geopolitical factors we've been talking about, those are playing a big role in their calculations. Maybe they're looking at the long game, thinking about how much more valuable this kind of strategic infrastructure will be in the future.
So let's dig into that leverage a bit more. If a U.S.-based company, BlackRock, gets control of these ports, what does that mean in practice? How much influence could they have, especially with all the trade tensions and competition with China? What kinds of scenarios could play out?
Well, the potential leverage is huge. Imagine trade disputes escalating. Controlling these ports could let them disrupt shipping, prioritize certain traffic, maybe even force Chinese goods onto longer, more expensive routes. The source we looked at mentioned that bypassing the Panama Canal, that could add thousands of miles to a journey. Think what that does to delivery times, to costs, to entire supply chains. Products from Asia to the U.S. East Coast suddenly taking weeks longer to arrive. That's a big deal.
It's almost like holding a strategic choke point on the world's trade routes. And you can easily see China retaliating, right? Maybe targeting CK Hutchinson or other companies with interests in mainland China if they see this deal as a hostile move. It gets complicated fast.
Oh, for sure. That comparison in the source to Boardwalk and Park Place and Monopoly, it's pretty spot on. These ports are prime real estate, strategically speaking. Losing control of them would be a major setback for China, especially in that region.
But this whole situation also brings up some really big questions about how corporations fit into international affairs these days. When a company as massive as BlackRock controls something as strategically important as the Panama Canal's ports, does it become an arm of the U.S. government, even if it's not official, acting in U.S. interests? It blurs the lines, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's a crucial point. BlackRock is a private company. Their legal obligations are to their shareholders, but this isn't just any asset. It's got huge geopolitical significance, and that raises questions about whose interests are really being served. It's a messy situation when private interests and national strategic goals get intertwined like this.
And the commentator in our source made another good point. Even if the U.S. gains some advantage from this deal, will regular Americans actually see any benefit? Or is it just BlackRock and its investors who come out ahead?
It all comes down to who benefits when strategic infrastructure gets privatized. Some might argue there are broader national security gains, or maybe the improved trade leverage helps everyone indirectly. But the direct profits from running these ports, the revenue, the control that goes to the owners, to the private operators, makes you wonder who really profits from these crucial assets.
It's also interesting to think that using a private company like BlackRock, maybe that's a deliberate strategy for the U.S., a way to get this strategic foothold without the government directly taking over the ports, which could have caused a much bigger international incident. Kind of like a proxy move in a larger geopolitical game, wouldn't you say?
That's a really insightful way to look at it. Using a private company creates a buffer, right? Allows the U.S. to exert influence without triggering the same kind of diplomatic backlash a direct government takeover would. It's almost like the private prison system where the government benefits without being directly responsible. There's a definite strategic advantage to that approach.
So where do things stand now? Is this deal actually happening, or are there still roadblocks ahead?
Well, as of right now, it's still just a proposal, and it's facing some serious challenges. As we've discussed, China has every reason to oppose this, and they're likely to pull out all the stops, diplomatic and economic, to try prevent it. They might even try to buy back the ports themselves later down the line. This is far from over.
Definitely seems like this could drag on for a while, and things could get pretty messy. It just goes to show how fragile these global trade networks really are, especially when you consider other disruptions we've seen lately, like those problems in the Suez Canal.
Exactly. Those issues in the Suez caused by all that instability, those are stark reminders that anything can happen. These shipping routes, they're vulnerable, and global trade can be thrown off course pretty easily. The Panama Canal might be on the other side of the world, but it's just as susceptible to these political and economic forces.
And it's wild to think that something like 70% of the Panama Canal's traffic is related to the U.S. Really shows how crucial this waterway is for the American economy, for its global trade relationships.
No doubt about it. It explains why this potential shift in control is causing such a fuss both within the U.S. and internationally. It's a big deal.
So to wrap up our deep dive here, we've been looking at a proposed deal where BlackRock, this big American investment firm, wants to buy the key ports at both ends of the Panama Canal from a company in Hong Kong. And this has set off some major international fireworks, especially with China. It raises questions about fair competition, about national security, about who holds the power in this complex web of global trade.
Exactly. The implications are huge. We could see changes in trade leverage, shifts in global influence, a bigger role for private companies in what might be seen as state-level power plays, and ultimately it comes down to who benefits most from these crucial global assets.
And that's the big question for you, our listener. As you think about all these competing interests, about the potential consequences, do you believe this deal with a private American company possibly controlling this vital global infrastructure, is it a good thing? What could it mean for the future of global trade for all of us in the long run?
This whole situation leaves us with a lot to think about. In a world that's increasingly interconnected with all these economic ties and competing ambitions, what unintended consequences might come out of this? What does this potential deal tell us about how global power is shifting in the 21st century? We encourage you to keep digging into this story, to consider all the different perspectives, and to draw your own conclusions. It's a fascinating, evolving situation.